There are so many different ideas about how to put together a training program. So much confusion about training. A dangerous fog about training, a fogginess that can lead to training shipwreck. There are many sources of that fog. Some of us became trainers and, without realizing it, brought with us ideas about teaching and education that became the basis of our thinking about equipment training. After all, we have a lifetime of experience with going to school, elementary school, high school, college courses. But are those ideas applicable to the equipment training world? I'd like to tell you two stories that I believe will help clear the fog. In the first story, you will meet a school teacher. The experience of the school teacher will make it easier for you to understand the second story, which is about an equipment trainer. Let me introduce you to Sally, a high school history teacher. Her experience is typical of many teachers in many countries, teaching many different subjects to many different age levels. So, Sally, please tell us how you develop or prepare for your classes.
All right, let me give you an example from a class I taught on the American Revolution. I started to plan a few weeks before I actually taught the class. I asked myself, what do I want my students to know about the American Revolution? Certainly, they should know about the causes of the Revolution. So I began to make a list of the theories on what caused the American Revolution. First, there is the economic factor, meaning the rising conflict in the British American colonies between the old aristocracy and the new merchant class. Second, there is what historians call the troublemaker theory. Some believe the revolution would not have happened if it were not for certain individuals good at stirring up passions in their neighbors. People like Sam Adams, who convinced people in Boston to throw the tea into the harbor. Changing philosophies of life was another cause. Simply put, there was a change from a religious view of life, the view of the Puritans, to a secular view, from a view of faith and authority to a view of reason and freedom. This new view helped lead to rebellion. That gives you an idea of how I began my lesson development. Of course, I added quite a bit more to these notes.
Sally, before you continue, let me ask the group a question. Exactly what is it that Sally has been writing down? An outline, you say? Yes, but an outline of what? Of her lesson? No, that would be too broad. Let us recall this diagram. Does it suggest what Sally's outline might be? That's right. It is an outline of the lesson content, what she wants the students to know. You could say that she has been preparing her lecture notes. Can you visualize Sally teaching her class using these notes? Right. Okay, Sally, what happens next?
Well, at the school where I teach, the principal requires me to fill out a teacher plan book each week. This is supposed to be helpful if I am unable to teach my class and a substitute teacher is brought in to teach my class. Anyway, I am supposed to describe the lesson for each day's class. In addition, the principal wants me to record an objective for each class. Well, each class is less than an hour, so one objective is probably enough. So I take the notes I've already prepared and write an objective at the start of each day's lesson in the plan book. So in the plan for Monday, I write this objective. Students will be able to explain the clash between the aristocracy and the rising middle class in the colonies. Tuesday, students will be able to list at least 3 ways that Sam Adams helped start a revolution with England. Wednesday, students will list 4 beliefs of the Age of Reason that helped to start the revolution.
Now, let's compare what Sally has done with the PBIT process diagram. She began with the creation of a content outline, what she wanted the students to know. Then, based on that, she created her objectives. Now you can see how her process is the opposite of the PBIT process, right? Now, our purpose is not to discuss whether the PBIT process applies to education or doesn't. Nevertheless, from Sally's explanation, it is very, very clear that the approach she uses is exactly opposite of what we think equipment trainers should do. Well, this is probably a good time to introduce our next guest, Joe Trainer. Joe is working at his cubicle. He looks over the soft wall in his office, and he sees his boss, the training manager. Joe, hey, I just learned from the general manager that our company has developed a new production tool. No one has ever mentioned this project to me. But engineering and marketing have been collaborating on it for the last 2 years. Well, last week, the first 2 machines were sold to ISM, instant semiconductor manufacturing. Of course, the purchase agreement requires a level 1 course for their technicians. And marketing and sales have already arranged for us to deliver that course on site at ISM in 6 weeks. Well, Joe, I know you like a challenge, so starting right now, I want you to develop a 5-day maintenance course for this new product. Okay, Joe? I know you'll do a fabulous job for us. For a few minutes, Joe is too stunned to decide how to get started. Then he realizes that he could learn a lot from the engineering department. So he calls the machine project's design engineer, Dr. Jones. Fortunately, Dr. Jones is the kind of engineer that wants to help the training department, so he agrees to meet with Joe on Thursday. That's 3 days away, but at least Joe has a plan now. When Joe gets to the engineering department on Thursday, Dr. Jones greets him and asks, "Where should we start?" "Anywhere you want," Joe replies, "but what I really need is an answer to this question. What do you think our customers' maintenance technicians will need to know about this machine?" Dr. Jones sits up and looks Joe straight in the eye and says, "Joe, you've come to the right place. I'll be happy to share all that I know." They step across the hall, and Dr. Jones begins by giving Joe an overview of the machine's key assemblies. Then, for the next 5 hours, Dr. Jones explains in detail how the machine is controlled and how it communicates. At times, he refers to a schematic. There are not many available yet, as the machine is new, so sometimes he shows Joe some of his own drawings on his computer. Joe is careful to take good notes, using both paper and a handheld tape recorder. Dr. Jones answers Joe's questions, he explains, and he clarifies. And by the end of the day, Joe has captured a lot of information about the new product from Dr. Jones. The following morning, Joe is back in his office. He has pages of notes, he has hours of tape recordings, and his head is pretty full too. He's trying to decide what to do next. He's worried about the deadline. He knows he has very little time between now and the time he must stand in front of his first class. What would you do? Well, here is what Joe does, and this is what so many other trainers do in just this situation. Maybe you have too. He sits in front of his computer, and he brings up PowerPoint. Then he goes through all the notes from Dr. Jones and organizes the information simplifies the information, and then, finally, he begins to create slides. He includes as much information as he can. That way, the slides will give him something to lean on, something to help him remember all that information from Dr. Jones. Besides, he is worried that he might get halfway through the training week and run out of material, so he wants to have plenty of slides. Does Joe's story sound familiar? Here's another question. Does Joe's story remind you of the story of Sally, the history teacher? It should. Let's go back to the diagram of the first 2 Peabody steps. Like Sally, Joe started with the content, the stuff the students need to know. What else did Joe do? Right, he created PowerPoint slides from all his notes. In other words, he created some instructional aids. By using this diagram, you can see that Joe did not follow the Peabody process. Now, if he goes through all his slides and creates some objectives based on what he wants the students to know from the slides, that will only make matters worse. What Joe should have done was to start with analysis, to start by developing a realistic list of all the tasks that the maintenance technicians would have to do on that new machine as part of their job. This list of tasks, along with their performance objectives, would then be a guide for helping Joe decide what content the students really need. Consider one last question. How much of all that information supplied by Dr. Jones will the maintenance technicians in Joe's class actually need to know? Well, of course, we don't really know. It might be as little as 10% of all that Dr. Jones told Joe, or as much as 80%. The problem is that Joe has no idea. And the only way he will really know is if he starts with analysis and the critical question, what will the maintenance technicians in my class be expected to do on my machine back on their jobs? Without that analysis, Joe has no way of knowing how much of Dr. Jones' information is relevant. So, Joe did not follow the Peabody process, and this will lead him to troubled waters, perhaps even stormy waters. And his students will know it. First, there is a strong likelihood that some or a lot of Joe's lecture material will not be relevant to his students. Second, this may cause students to be bored. The danger here is that we are talking about customers. Third, Joe's false steps may lead to wasted class time, time that students could put to better use with more vital hands-on activities. Fourth, and most importantly, the entire course design may be so far from meeting student needs that they leave the class without competency, without the expected performance improvement. And finally, there is a long-term danger. Since course materials often are not updated, evaluated, or revised, it is likely that Joe's training department will keep all those materials for years to come, even if they are not relevant. So all of the other 4 problems may just continue on into the future. One last comment on Joe's story. Remember when the manager asked Joe to create a 5-day course for the customer? Okay, 2 things about that. 1, there is no way the manager could know how long the course should be prior to following the Peabody steps. Why? Because no one has yet created a list of the required tasks that the customer technicians must be able to perform. The length of the course is determined in part by the number of tasks to be taught and the amount of time required to practice those tasks in class. And 2, when the length of the course is set from the beginning, it creates very real pressure on the course developer to fill the time. And this is often what leads to irrelevant lectures and other activities filling up the time. I hope these stories have helped to bring to life a few of the differences between the PBIT process and other approaches to training. Of course, the key point is analysis must be done, and it must be done before getting started with design or develop questions.